My name is Sam, and for the better part of 15 years, my life has revolved around the predictable hum of a well-oiled machine. That machine is my business, precision irrigation and landscaping. It's not a glamorous job, but it's an honest one, built on the simple principles of making water go where it's supposed to and making grass grow where it should. I live in a neighborhood called Maple Creek Estates, a quiet collection of suburban houses where the biggest news for a decade was a rogue woodpecker with a vendetta against cedar siding. I liked it that way. I'm a quiet guy by nature. I prefer the company of PVC pipes and solenoid valves to neighborhood potlucks. I do my work, I keep my lawn immaculate, and I nod to my neighbors when I get the mail. It was a simple, peaceful existence. My own property was my business card. The lawn was a lush, green carpet, thick and perfectly manicured. It had to be. My irrigation system was a custom-built masterpiece, a multi-zone marvel of efficiency that I designed and installed myself. It used smart controllers, rain sensors, and precisely calibrated sprinkler heads to deliver the exact amount of water needed, no more, no less. It was my passion project and my best advertisement. Neighbors would often stop and ask how I kept my lawn looking so good, which usually led to a new client. I was proud of it, not in a boastful way, but in the quiet, satisfying way a craftsman is proud of his best work. I minded my own business, paid my dues, and expected the same in return. The Maple Creek Homeowners Association had always been a benign, almost invisible entity. For years, it was run by a retired accountant named Mr. Henderson, a man whose idea of aggressive governance was sending a polite, mimeographed newsletter 4 times a year. The HOA dues were reasonable, and they covered the mowing of the small common area near the entrance and the plowing of our private road in the winter. Nobody complained because there was nothing to complain about. It was a system that worked precisely because it did so little. It was a background detail, like the color of the sky, something you never really thought about until it changed. And then, it changed. About 2 years ago, a woman named Karen Albright moved into the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. She arrived with a palpable energy, a kind of restless intensity that stood out in our sleepy corner of the world. Within 6 months, she was on the HOA board. Mr. Henderson, citing a desire to spend more time with his model trains, had stepped down. In the vacuum, Karen seized power with the speed and efficiency of an invasive weed. By the end of her first year, she was the president, and the quiet hum of Maple Creek began to change into a low, anxious buzz. The first signs were small, almost trivial. A new rule was distributed via a glossy, professionally printed pamphlet, a far cry from Mr. Henderson's smudged copies. This one dictated that all trash and recycling bins had to be retrieved from the curb no later than 6 o'clock in the evening on collection day. It was a minor inconvenience, but the tone was what caught my attention. It was filled with phrases like upholding community standards and maintaining aesthetic uniformity. A month later came the edict on holiday decorations. They could not be erected before the 1st of December and had to be completely removed by the 10th of January. Violators would be subject to a $25 fine. People grumbled. My neighbor to the left, a cheerful fellow named George, had always put up his light-up reindeer the day after Thanksgiving. He took them down, muttering about petty tyrants, but he took them down. It was easier to comply than to fight. The rules kept coming. A specific shade of off-white was mandated for any mailbox post replacements. Basketball hoops could no longer be left at the end of driveways overnight. For sale, the signs had to be a specific, board-approved size and design. Each new rule was a small encroachment, a tightening of a screw we never knew was there. Karen, it seemed, was on a mission to mold our quiet, slightly imperfect neighborhood into her personal vision of suburban perfection, whether we liked it or not. My first inkling that this quiet life was about to be disrupted came not in a glossy pamphlet, but in a thin, stark white envelope from the municipal water department. I almost tossed it with the junk mail, assuming it was the usual quarterly bill. But the bold, red text on the front, urgent, abnormal usage detected, caught my eye. I slit it open, my brow furrowed with mild curiosity. That curiosity curdled into disbelief as I unfolded the statement. The number at the bottom was staggering. It was more than 10 times my normal usage. It was enough water to fill a small swimming pool. I looked at the usage graph, and it showed a massive, continuous spike that had started about 3 weeks prior. My mind raced. A leak. It had to be a major leak. But my system was state-of-the-art. I had flow sensors. The controller should have detected an anomaly and shut the system down, sending an alert to my phone. I checked my phone, no alerts. I went to the smart controller in my garage. No errors logged. This didn't make sense. A catastrophic failure should have triggered a dozen safeguards. I walked the perimeter of my property, my eye scanning the pristine lawn for any sign of a problem, a soggy patch, a telltale greening in one area, anything. Everything looked perfect. The system had run its cycle just that morning, the sprinklers retracting back into the turf with their usual quiet efficiency. I spent the rest of the day troubleshooting, running diagnostics, and manually checking every single zone. It was maddening. The system was functioning perfectly. The pressure was stable. There were no visible signs of water pooling anywhere. Yet the water meter near the curb was spinning like a top. The leak was real, it was massive, and it was somewhere underground, hidden from view. I grabbed a shovel and a soil probe and went to the most logical place, the main line that ran from the meter to the manifold that distributed water to the various zones. It took me 2 hours of careful probing and digging, but I finally found it. The ground was saturated about a foot down, in a corner of my yard that bordered the HOA common area. The soil was mud, a hidden quagmire beneath a perfect carpet of green grass. I carefully excavated the area around the main PVC line, my frustration mounting with every shovelful of heavy, wet earth. And then I saw it. It wasn't a simple crack from a freeze or a root. The pipe had been cut clean through. But that wasn't the worst of it. Someone had attempted a repair they had used a cheap, ill-fitting rubber coupling held on with 2 rusty hose clamps. It was the kind of amateurish, shoddy work I'd expect to see in a slapstick comedy, not on a professionally installed irrigation system. The coupling was leaking profusely, a steady, silent hemorrhage of water into the subsoil. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. The cut was too clean to be from a shovel strike, and the repair was a deliberate act of incompetence designed to create exactly this kind of problem, a huge, hidden leak that wouldn't register as a pressure drop on my system's sensors but would dump thousands of gallons of water into the ground. A cold anger settled in my gut. Who would do this? Why? It felt personal, targeted. I stood there, leaning on my shovel in the deepening twilight, the silence of the neighborhood suddenly feeling less peaceful and more menacing. Before I could even begin to formulate a plan or wrap my head around the violation, the next assault arrived. The following afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was thicker, bearing the newly redesigned Maple Creek HOA logo. Inside was a formal letter, printed on heavy cardstock. It was a notice of violation. It cited a bylaw I'd never heard of, Article 7, Section 4B, Prohibition of Excessive Water Usage Detrimental to Community Resources and Property. It went on to state that my property had created a hazardous swamp-like condition on the adjacent common area, posing a risk to the community's landscape and potentially damaging the roots of a shared maple tree. The fine was $500. My eye scanned down the page, my anger turning to a hot, simmering rage. The letter was signed with a flourish by Karen Albright, President. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. They sabotage my property, cause a massive water leak, and then fine me for the consequences of their own actions. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic perversion. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was a declaration of war. I spent that evening properly repairing the damage. I cut out the sabotaged section of pipe, my hands working with mechanical precision while my mind churned. I fitted a new, professional-grade compression coupling, primed and sealed it correctly, and let it cure. As I refilled the hole and carefully replaced the turf, I made a decision. I was not going to let this go. I was not going to just pay the fine and move on. Karen had picked a fight with the wrong person. She might know how to write condescending letters and invent nonsensical rules, but I knew how to build things, how to fix things, and how to methodically take a problem apart to find its root cause. And I was going to apply that same methodical approach to her. The next morning, I composed a calm, professional email to the HOA board. I attached a copy of my colossal water bill and photos of the deliberately damaged pipe and the shoddy repair. I explained, in clear and simple terms, that my system had been vandalized, that this was the sole cause of the excessive water usage, and that I had since repaired the damage myself. I respectfully requested that the unfounded fine be rescinded immediately. I hit send and waited, feeling a small sense of satisfaction that the clear, undeniable facts would surely prevail. The reply came less than an hour later, from Karen's personal email address. It was curt and dismissive. "Mr. Miller," it began, "the board has received your email. However, the photographic evidence you provided only serves to reinforce our position. It clearly depicts a substandard, amateur repair on your irrigation line, which is indicative of the overall quality of your installation. The bylaws are clear. The fine stands. Please remit payment within 15 days to avoid further penalties." I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the message. She was twisting the narrative, using my repair of her sabotage as proof of my own incompetence. It was an audacious, almost brilliant, piece of gaslighting. She was daring me to challenge her. It was then I realized that logic and reason were not going to work. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, malicious attack. My attempt at a reasonable resolution had been met with a brick wall of arrogance. The screw wasn't just being tightened anymore, it was being stripped. I decided a face-to-face conversation was necessary. Perhaps, I thought, she would be less brazen without the digital wall of an email to hide behind. I found her outside her house later that day, meticulously measuring the distance between her mailbox and the curb with a tape measure. She looked up as I approached, her expression souring as she recognized me. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice clipped. "Can I help you?" "Karen," I began, keeping my tone as even as I could manage. "I think we have a serious misunderstanding about this fine. My system was vandalized. Someone cut my main line." I tried to show her the pictures on my phone again. She waved a dismissive hand, not even glancing at the screen. "I am not interested in your excuses," she said, her eyes cold. "The fact is, your property created a water hazard. Your equipment failed. It is your responsibility. The fine is $500. It is due in 13 days. "But that's not what happened," I insisted, my frustration growing. "Look at the photos. That rubber coupling? I didn't install that. Someone put that there. It was designed to leak." Her lips tightened into a thin, hard line. "Are you accusing someone of trespassing on your property? Do you have any proof of this wild allegation?" "A police report, perhaps." The sarcastic edge in her voice was unmistakable. She knew I didn't have that kind of proof. "Not yet. I'm telling you what I found," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts. "I expect the HOA to look into it, not to fine me for it." She actually gave a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. "The HOA is not your personal security force. We enforce the community's bylaws, which you have clearly violated. Pay the fine, Mr. Miller. Or the next one will be for $1,000, plus late fees." She then turned her back on me, returning to her measurements as if I had ceased to exist. The conversation was over. The threat was clear. The next 2 weeks were a study in escalating absurdity. As promised, when the 15-day deadline passed, a new letter arrived. This one was sent via certified mail. The original $500 fine was now compounded with a $500 late fee and a new, separate $1,000 fine for failure to comply with a board directive. The total was now $2,000. The letter also contained a new threat: failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien being placed on my property. My anger was now mixed with a heavy dose of anxiety. A lien was a serious legal tool. It could affect my credit, my ability to sell my house. This petty neighborhood squabble was spiraling into something that could have real, long-term financial consequences. Karen was weaponizing the HOA's power with a vindictiveness that was frankly shocking. She wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was a bully who enjoyed watching people squirm. The impact of the conflict began to ripple outwards, affecting more than just my bank account. The ground saturation from the leak, though now stopped, had been significant. It had softened the earth around the main water shut-off valve for my immediate neighbors. One afternoon, I saw a city utility truck parked outside the home of Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who had lived on our street for 40 years. The workers were having trouble accessing the main valve box, which had sunk slightly into the mud. They had to shut off the water to her house for several hours while they dug it out and reset it. I went over to see if she was all right. She was flustered and upset. "Oh, Sam," she said, wringing her hands. "They said the ground is all soft. They had to turn everything off. I can't even make a cup of tea." I explained the situation to her, about the leak and my dispute with the HOA. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern. "That Karen," she whispered, leaning in as if the woman herself might be listening. "She's been sending notices to everyone. Told old Mr. Carlson his bird bath was an unapproved lawn ornament. The woman has too much time on her hands." Karen, never one to miss an opportunity, seized on Mrs. Gable's inconvenience. The next day, a notice was posted on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. It didn't mention me by name, but the target was obvious. It was a sanctimonious screed about responsible water management and how the negligence of one homeowner can have serious consequences for the entire community, citing the recent disruption to essential utility services. She was painting me as a public menace, using the very situation she had created to turn my neighbors against me. A few neighbors expressed their sympathy in quiet, furtive conversations over the fence or at the grocery store. "This is crazy, Sam," George from next door told me while pretending to inspect his azaleas. "But you know how she is. I got a warning last week because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfect circle. I don't want to get on her bad side." The sentiment was the same everywhere. People were angry, but they were also intimidated. Karen had cultivated an atmosphere of fear, and no one was willing to be her next target. I was on my own. The threat of the lien was the final straw. This was no longer something I could handle with emails and polite conversations. This was a legal attack, and I needed a legal defense. I spent an afternoon researching lawyers who specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. I found a man named Arthur Croft, a seasoned attorney whose website listed fighting homeowner association overreach as one of his primary practice areas. I called his office and scheduled a consultation for the following day. Arthur Croft's office was in a modest brick building downtown. He was an older gentleman with a calm, reassuring demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened intently as I laid out the entire story, from the arrival of Karen to the astronomical water bill, the sabotage, the escalating fines, and the threat of the lien. I showed him the letters, the photos of the damaged pipe, and a copy of the community bulletin board notice. He examined everything with a practiced eye, occasionally nodding or making a small note on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Well, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "You've certainly found yourself in a classic David and Goliath situation. HOAs can be notoriously difficult. They often have broad powers granted by the covenants, and boards can operate with very little oversight." My heart sank a little. "So, I'm stuck?" I asked. "Not at all," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Difficult is not the same as impossible. Her case against you is built on a foundation of lies. The problem, as always, is proof. Right now, it's your word against hers. Her position as president gives her a veneer of authority. We need to crack that veneer. The sabotage is the key. If we can prove she was involved, or at least that the HOA was responsible through its agents, then her entire case against you collapses. In fact, it becomes a case of harassment and fraud against her." "Her agents?" I asked. "You mean the maintenance crew?" Arthur nodded. Exactly. You mentioned she hired a new company recently. Who are they? Have you looked into them? I admitted I hadn't. I only knew they were a new outfit that had replaced the reliable, long-serving company we'd used for years. That's your starting point, Arthur advised. Find out everything you can about this company. Who owns it? Are they properly licensed and insured? Pull the HOA's financial records for the last year. As a homeowner, you have the right to inspect them. Look at the invoices from this company. See what they've been billing for. Follow the money. Bullies like this are often hiding something, and it's usually related to money or power. I left Arthur Croft's office with a clear plan of action and a renewed sense of purpose. The legal fees were going to be substantial, but it was no longer just about the money. It was about the principle. I was being extorted, and my reputation in the community I had lived in for 15 years was being systematically destroyed. I was no longer just defending myself, I was going on the offensive. The investigation had begun. My first step was to formally request the HOA's financial records. I drafted a letter citing the specific state statute that guaranteed my right as a homeowner to inspect the association's books. I sent it via certified mail to the official HOA address, ensuring there was a legal record of my request. Karen couldn't ignore this. By law, she had 10 business days to comply. While I waited for her inevitable stonewalling or slow walking of my request, I started digging into the maintenance company. The name on their truck, which I'd seen parked in the neighborhood, was Total Property Solutions. A quick search online revealed they had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos and vague promises of excellence and reliability. There was no physical address listed, only a post office box in the next town over. The About Us page was suspiciously empty. This was not the hallmark of a professional, established company. I ran a corporate record search through the state's business registry. Total Property Solutions, LLC was registered just over a year ago. The registered agent and sole officer listed on the paperwork was a man named Frank Coleman. The name meant nothing to me. I decided to dig deeper, cross-referencing Frank Coleman with Karen Albright. It took some creative searching on social media and public records databases, but I finally found the connection. A wedding announcement from a few years back, from a local newspaper's online archive. Frank Coleman had married Karen's younger sister. He was her brother-in-law. A jolt went through me. This was it. This was the crack in the veneer Arthur had talked about. The president of the HOA had fired a long-standing, reputable contractor and replaced them with a brand-new, unproven company owned by her own brother-in-law. It was a massive, undeniable conflict of interest. It reeked of cronyism and corruption. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I was on the right track. 10 days passed, and there was no response to my request for the financial records. On the 11th day, I had Arthur send a formal legal letter, reminding the board of their statutory obligation and warning them of the legal penalties for non-compliance. 2 days later, I received a terse email from Karen. It said the records were available for my inspection, but only on a specific Tuesday afternoon, for a 1-hour window, at her home. It was another power play, another attempt to make things as difficult and intimidating as possible. I arrived at her house at the appointed time, my stomach tight with nerves. She led me to her dining room table, where a single, thin accordion file lay. "Here you go," she said, her arms crossed. "You have 1 hour." The file contained a handful of monthly bank statements and a small stack of invoices. It was woefully incomplete, but it was a start. I ignored her hovering presence and began taking pictures of every single document with my phone. The invoices from Total Property Solutions immediately stood out. They were vague, with line items like general maintenance, landscape upkeep, and common area servicing, all for suspiciously round, large numbers. They were charging the HOA thousands of dollars every month for what amounted to mowing a half-acre of grass and trimming a few bushes. It was highway robbery. Then I found the invoice that made my blood run cold. It was dated from the week my leak had started. The line item was for an emergency repair of common area main water line. The charge was $1,500. I knew for a fact that no such repair had taken place. The common area didn't even have its own separate water line. It was irrigated by a system tied to the neighborhood's overall water supply, which had never been interrupted. This invoice was a complete fabrication. It was a ghost charge, a way to bill the HOA for the time her brother-in-law's crew spent on my property, digging up my pipe. It was the cover-up. They weren't just sabotaging my property, they were making the entire neighborhood pay for it. Armed with this new evidence, the picture was becoming clearer, but I still lacked the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle, direct proof that they were on my property. A fraudulent invoice and a family connection were damning, but they were circumstantial. Karen could argue her brother-in-law's company was simply incompetent, that they billed for work they thought they did. I needed something that placed them at the scene of the crime. My mind kept going back to that night. What had I missed? What could I have seen? And then, it hit me with the force of a physical blow. The camera. Months ago, when I had finished the landscaping around my new patio, I had installed a small, discreet security camera. It was a motion-activated wildlife camera, really, designed to see if deer were eating my hostas. It was tucked away inside a birdhouse, its tiny lens pointed towards the back corner of my yard, the exact corner where the pipe had been cut. I had completely forgotten about it. The battery life was long, and it recorded to a local SD card, so I rarely checked it. My heart hammered in my chest as I rushed to the garage, retrieved the small ladder, and carefully opened the birdhouse. The camera was still there. The indicator light was blinking. It was still working. I pulled the SD card, my fingers trembling slightly. I slid it into my computer, my breath held tight in my chest. The files were organized by date. I navigated to the approximate week the leak had begun and started clicking through the video clips. There were dozens of them, a rabbit hopping across the lawn, a stray cat, the neighbor's dog. And then I found it. The timestamp was 1:30 in the morning, 3.5 weeks ago. The infrared night vision cast the scene in an eerie black and white. The video showed two men, their features indistinct but their work clothes clearly bearing the Total Property Solutions logo, digging in the exact spot where I had later found the leak. They were working quickly, furtively. And then, a third figure stepped into the frame. The person was standing back, watching, arms crossed. The camera was too far away to capture a clear facial image, but the posture, the haircut, the build, it was unmistakable. It was Karen Albright. She was there. She watched for a minute, seemed to say something to the two men, and then walked out of the frame. The men finished their work, quickly filled the hole, and left. The entire clip was less than 5 minutes long. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was the smoking gun. It was irrefutable. I had her. I had the conflict of interest. I had the fraudulent invoices. And now I had video evidence of her personally overseeing the sabotage of my property. The game had changed. I was no longer on the defensive. I held all the cards. My first call was to Arthur Croft. I sent him the video file and the photos of the invoices. He called me back within minutes, a note of genuine excitement in his voice. "Sam, this is it," he said. "This is more than I could have hoped for. This isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This is criminal. Fraud, conspiracy, destruction of property. We have them, lock, stock, and barrel." We spent the next hour mapping out our strategy. Arthur's advice was clear: do not confront her. Do not tip our hand. Let her continue to believe she was in control. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It was the perfect venue. It was a public forum where she would be at her most arrogant, her most powerful. And it was where we would dismantle her, piece by piece, in front of the very people she had been terrorizing. The plan was to move from a defensive posture to a full-scale offensive. Arthur began preparing a comprehensive evidence packet. It included the corporate filings for Total Property Solutions, the evidence of the family relationship, copies of the fraudulent invoices, a comparative quote from another licensed irrigation company showing the massive price gouging, my water bill, my photos of the damage, and the sworn affidavit I would write detailing the entire timeline of events. The centerpiece, of course, would be the video. For the next 3 weeks, I had to play the part of the beaten man. I led the HOA's deadline for the $2,000 payment pass. Another certified letter arrived, this one officially informing me that the HOA was placing a lien on my property. I accepted it without protest. I saw Karen at the mailboxes once. She gave me a smug, triumphant smirk. "Time is running out, Mr. Miller," she said. I just nodded grimly and walked away, letting her savor what she thought was her victory. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but I knew the payoff would be worth it. During this time, I quietly reached out to a few of my neighbors, the ones I trusted. I didn't reveal the full extent of what I had, but I told George and Mrs. Gable and a few others that I had uncovered some serious issues with the HOA's finances and management, and that it was imperative they attend the annual meeting. The word began to spread. A current of discontent had been flowing just beneath the surface of Maple Creek for months, and now it was beginning to coalesce. People were tired of the petty rules, the constant stream of violation notices, and Karen's dictatorial style. They were ready for a change. The night of the annual meeting arrived. It was held in the small clubhouse by the community pool. In previous years, maybe 10 or 15 people would show up, mostly out of a sense of civic duty. Tonight, the room was packed. Nearly every household was represented. There were over 60 people crowded into the small space, lining the walls and spilling out the door. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Karen and the 2 other board members, a pair of nervous-looking men who always seemed to be in her shadow, sat at a folding table at the front of the room. Karen looked surprised and a little annoyed by the massive turnout. She banged a small gavel on the table to call the meeting to order, a self-important frown etched on her face. She ran through the initial agenda items, the reading of the previous meeting's minutes, the treasurer's report, with brisk, impatient efficiency. Her report was full of self-congratulation about how she had improved the community's financial health and enforced standards. I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then, she came to the part of the agenda titled Action on Delinquent Accounts. She cleared her throat and looked directly at me, a cruel glint in her eye. "Our final item of new business," she announced to the room, "concerns the property at 12 Oak Street. The owner, Mr. Samuel Miller, has repeatedly refused to pay fines for serious bylaw violations and has allowed a hazardous condition on his property to impact his neighbors. The board has therefore voted to place a lien on his property. We are simply reporting this action to the community as a matter of public record." A murmur went through the crowd. This was it. This was my cue. I stood up. Arthur Croft, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up with me and walked to the front of the room. I was carrying a laptop, and he was carrying a small projector and screen. "Madam President," Arthur said, his voice calm but carrying easily through the silent room. "My name is Arthur Croft. I am Mr. Miller's legal counsel. My client would like to address the board and the community regarding this matter." Karen's face flushed with anger. "This is not a courtroom, sir. This is a closed meeting for homeowners. Mr. Miller has had ample opportunity to address this." "The time for discussion is over." "I'm afraid not," Arthur replied smoothly. "And according to the bylaws, any homeowner has the right to address the community during the annual meeting. We've brought a short presentation without waiting for her permission." I set up the projector and laptop. The 2 other board members looked at each other nervously, but Karen was seething. "This is out of order," she hissed. "The only thing out of order," I said, my voice steady and clear as I turned to face my neighbors, "is what has been happening in this community under Karen Albright's leadership." I clicked the first slide. It was a simple corporate filing document for Total Property Solutions, with Frank Coleman's name clearly visible. "This is the company our HOA hired for grounds maintenance," I explained. I clicked to the next slide, a picture of the wedding announcement. "And this is its owner, Frank Coleman, who happens to be Karen Albright's brother-in-law." A fact she failed to disclose to the community when she awarded his brand new company a lucrative, no-bid contract. Gasps and angry whispers filled the room. Karen was on her feet now, her face a mask of fury. "This is a slanderous accusation. This is a private family matter." "It became a community matter," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "When you started using our dues to pay his fraudulent invoices, I projected the invoice for the emergency repair next. Here is an invoice for $1,500 for a repair to a water line that doesn't exist. This was submitted during the same week that my own irrigation line was mysteriously cut." I then showed them my water bill, the photos of the sabotage, and my calm, reasonable email to the board, followed by Karen's dismissive, insulting reply. I laid out the whole story, the escalating fines, the threat of the lien. With each slide, the mood in the room grew darker and more hostile, not towards me, but towards the woman at the front table. Her two board allies were visibly shrinking in their seats, trying to distance themselves from her. "Karen has accused me of negligence," I said, my voice ringing with indignation. "She has fined me thousands of dollars and is attempting to put a lien on my home. She claims I am the one who created a hazard. But I have one final piece of evidence to share with you all. It will show you who is truly responsible." I took a deep breath and clicked the play button. The grainy, black and white video filled the screen. The room was utterly silent. Everyone watched, transfixed, as the two men from Total Property Solutions dug up my yard in the dead of night. And then, when Karen herself walked into the frame, a collective gasp swept through the clubhouse. There was no denying it. It was her. Watching. Overseeing the entire operation. When the clip ended, I turned off the projector. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her face pale, her mouth slightly agape. Then the dam of her composure broke. "It's fake," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's a doctored video. He's trying to frame me. This is an illegal recording." Arthur Croft stepped forward. "The video is timestamped, and the original file is secure, Madam President. And as it was recorded on my client's private property, it is perfectly legal. We have already forwarded this entire evidence packet, including the video, to the district attorney's office. They expressed a great deal of interest in the invoices, in particular." That was the final blow. The mention of the district attorney sent a shockwave through the room. One of the other board members, a man named Henderson, slumped in his chair and put his head in his hands. The other one started stammering, "I didn't know anything about this, I swear." She handled all the contracts. The authority Karen had so carefully cultivated completely evaporated in an instant. The crowd erupted. People were yelling, shouting questions, demanding her resignation. She stood there, sputtering, trying to shout them down, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of outrage. A neighbor I recognized as an off-duty police officer stood up, his face grim. "I think you should probably stay right where you are, Karen," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'm going to make a phone call." The meeting was over. Her reign was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The police arrived before the chaotic meeting had even fully dispersed. Karen and her two brother-in-law's employees were taken in for questioning that night. The district attorney's office, armed with the evidence packet Arthur and I had provided, moved quickly. An official investigation was launched into the HOA's finances, and what they found was even worse than I had suspected. Karen had been running the HOA like her personal piggy bank, using community funds for everything from personal landscaping at her own home to paying her brother-in-law's company for a litany of phantom jobs. A few months later, to avoid a public trial and the risk of a longer sentence, Karen Albright and Frank Coleman pleaded guilty. Karen was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. Frank was convicted of conspiracy and destruction of property. Given that it was a first offense for both, they avoided jail time, but the punishment was still severe. Karen was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay full restitution to the Maple Creek HOA, a sum that amounted to nearly $40,000. Frank lost his business license permanently and was hit with a massive fine. The financial blow was devastating for them. Within 6 months, a for sale sign, one of the old, non-regulation kind, went up in front of Karen's house. They had to sell to cover the court-ordered restitution and their own legal fees. For me, vindication was total and complete. The first action of the interim HOA board, hastily assembled in the wake of the scandal, was to expunge all fines and formally withdraw the lien against my property. They issued a public, written apology to me on behalf of the community and insisted on reimbursing me not only for the astronomical water bill but also for my legal fees. My reputation was more than restored. I was treated as a local hero. People who had been afraid to make eye contact with me were now stopping me in the street to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to her. It was a strange and humbling experience. I had never sought the spotlight, but I had been thrust into it by circumstance. The community itself underwent a profound reformation. The old, corrupted HOA was formally dissolved. The residents voted to replace it with a much simpler, more transparent neighborhood committee. The labyrinthine book of rules and regulations that Karen had created was ceremoniously shredded at a neighborhood barbecue. The new bylaws were reduced to a single page, focusing only on the essentials, maintaining the common areas and ensuring the roads were plowed. The guiding principle was common sense and neighborly respect, not punitive enforcement. I was nominated to lead the new committee, an offer I politely but firmly declined. "Thank you," I told them, "but I'm much better with sprinkler heads than I am with gavels," they understood. The community hired back the old, reliable maintenance crew that Karen had fired, and the neighborhood returned to a state of quiet, peaceful cooperation. It was, in many ways, better than it had been before Karen's reign of terror, because now we all appreciated just how fragile that peace could be. Several years have passed since that tumultuous time. Maple Creek Estates is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's not the silence of apathy, but the comfortable silence of a community at ease with itself. Property values have risen steadily, and the neighborhood has gained a reputation as a friendly, well-managed place to live. The common areas are neatly kept, the roads are always clear in the winter, and no one measures the distance of their mailbox from the curb. We look out for one another. The shared experience of overthrowing a petty tyrant had forged a bond among us. I did see Karen one more time, about a year after she sold her house. I was in a discount grocery store in the next town over, picking up some work supplies. I was in the checkout line when I heard a familiar, clipped voice from the next register. I glanced over, and there she was. She was wearing the store's drab uniform, her hair pulled back severely. She looked tired, diminished. The fiery arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. She was scanning items with a detached, mechanical efficiency. Our eyes met for a brief second across the aisles. A flicker of recognition, of shame, crossed her face. She looked away quickly, but then, after a moment's hesitation, she looked back and gave me the smallest, most imperceptible of nods. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement. An admission. I simply nodded back once, a gesture of finality, and then turned to pay for my items. There was no triumph in seeing her humbled, no surge of satisfaction. There was only a quiet, melancholy sense that justice, in its own slow and grinding way, had been served. I think about that whole ordeal sometimes, usually when I'm out in my yard on a quiet morning. It's a stark reminder of how easily a small amount of power can warp a person, turning them from a neighbor into a despot. Karen wasn't born a monster, she was just a person who became so fixated on her own narrow vision of order that she lost sight of her own humanity, and ours. She believed the rules were more important than the people they were meant to serve. The whole affair taught me that bullies, whether they're on the playground or in the boardroom of an HOA, thrive on the silence and fear of others. They count on good people deciding it's easier to comply than to fight. But it also taught me that when one person finally stands up and speaks the plain, simple truth, that foundation of fear can crumble into dust. Tyrants, big and small, often sow the seeds of their own destruction. My life is back to its predictable hum now. I run my business. I work on my lawn. My irrigation system, my masterpiece, runs flawlessly. This morning, as I was out checking the sprinkler heads, Making a minor adjustment to one that was spraying a little too far onto the sidewalk, Mrs. Gable came over from her yard. She was carrying a tall glass of iced tea, beads of condensation running down its side. "Thought you might be thirsty, Sam," she said with a warm smile. We stood there for a while, chatting about the spectacular blooms on her hydrangeas this year and the rogue woodpecker who seemed to have returned. The sun was warm, the grass was green, and the neighborhood was at peace. My life was wonderfully, beautifully, blessedly quiet. And that's exactly how I intend to keep it.